I hadn't even made it halfway down the aisle when I saw him, my father standing stiff in the far corner of the church vestibule, flanked by neatly dressed guests and the overwhelming scent of white lilies. The soft murmur of strings drifted from the sanctuary like a memory of something gentle, something I used to believe weddings should be. For a moment I almost convinced myself that I belonged there. I smoothed the front of my plain navy dress, adjusted the sleeves and pressed my lips together to keep my nerves in check. No medals, no rank. I hadn't worn my uniform for a reason. I didn't want to make a statement. I just wanted to see my little sister get married. That was it. But then he stepped forward. My father's voice was low and sharp, a whisper meant only for me but with all the bite of a slap. "Why are you even here?" The words stopped me cold. It wasn't a question. It wasn't concern or confusion. It was accusation, judgment wrapped in steel and spite, honed after years of silence and estrangement. I looked at him, at the deep lines carved into his face, at the way his jaw tightened like it had so many times before when I disappointed him by simply existing as myself. His gray eyes were colder than I remembered, and in them I saw nothing of the father who used to carry me on his shoulders through cornfields or teach me how to skip rocks at the lake. That man was long gone. If he had ever truly existed, he had vanished long before Madison's engagement. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew that no explanation, no defense of my presence, would satisfy him. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted to make sure I knew I wasn't welcome. That this place, this moment, this family event was not mine to be part of. I glanced toward the sanctuary doors. Inside, Madison was probably having her veil adjusted, maybe laughing nervously with our cousin Kayla or crying over some forgotten flower arrangement. She hadn't seen me yet. She didn't know I was here. Part of me thought maybe it was better that way. I could slip out now, unnoticed, and save her from whatever fallout my presence might cause. The last thing I wanted was to ruin her day. But another part of me, the part that had crouched behind a Humvee while bullets cracked overhead, that had stitched up wounds and carried brothers in arms through sand and blood, that part was angry. Furious even. I had done nothing wrong. I'd flown across the country, taken time off work, paid for my own hotel, all to be there for a sister who used to braid my hair and sleep in my bed after bad dreams. I hadn't come to fight. I hadn't come to prove anything. I came because I loved her. Because she asked me to. Still, my father's voice rang in my ears, colder than the church's air conditioning. "Why are you even here?" I realized I'd stopped moving, frozen just inside the vestibule while other guests passed by without a second glance. Some nodded politely, some offered soft smiles, but none seemed to notice the quiet war playing out in our corner of the room. Typical, really. My father had always been good at keeping things clean on the outside while letting them rot from within. Our family functioned on appearances. Disagreements were tucked away like bad wallpaper, layered over and ignored. He took a step closer. "You think putting on a dress and showing up makes you part of this family again?" I could smell his cologne, familiar and sharp like the aftershave he used when I was a kid. I remembered hugging him once when he wore it and feeling like he smelled like home. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. "I'm here for Madison," I said quietly, finally finding my voice. "That's all." He scoffed. "She doesn't need you. She has real support." The insult settled into my chest like a stone. I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak again without shaking. I took one step back, then another, retreating toward the shadowed corner near the church doors. The organ music shifted. The prelude was ending. It was almost time. Soon everyone would stand. The doors would open. Madison would walk down the aisle with all eyes on her. And I would decide whether I was still going to be standing here when that happened. I was 2 steps from the door, fingers clenched around the strap of my purse like it was the only anchor I had left, when I heard my name, just barely but enough to stop me. It wasn't loud, more of a breath than a word, but it cut through the soft hum of music and murmured conversations like a blade. I turned slowly, already regretting it, already bracing for another dagger in the shape of a whisper. But it wasn't my father this time. It was Caleb. He was standing halfway down the center aisle, just outside the row where the wedding party was seated. His eyes were locked on me, wide and startled, and his face had gone completely pale beneath the tidy trim of his beard. I watched him blink, shake his head slightly like he didn't trust what he was seeing, then pivot toward an older man seated at the end of the pew. I recognized the man instantly. You didn't serve for a decade without learning the faces of the brass, especially when they were legends. General Everett Hale. Even out of uniform, even in a soft gray suit with a boutonniere pinned neatly to his lapel, the man radiated authority like a low hum in the air. His spine was straight, his expression composed. Caleb leaned down and whispered something hurried, his hand briefly resting on the general's shoulder. Whatever it was, it changed everything in an instant. The general didn't ask a question. He didn't hesitate. He simply stood. I felt the shift in the room before I saw it. A hush rolled through the church, subtle but unmistakable. The musicians faltered, just slightly but enough that the melody trembled, and several guests turned, drawn by the sudden, inexplicable change in atmosphere. I stood there frozen, my hand still gripping my bag, caught between fight and flight, when General Hale turned and looked directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine like a laser sight. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in his gaze. Just immediate recognition and something else. Something I hadn't seen from another human being in a long time. Respect. He raised his right hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. It wasn't symbolic or ceremonial. It was textbook. Perfect angle, perfect form. The kind of salute you give to someone whose rank or actions demand it. The kind that carries weight. The air in the room seemed to pause. Guests turned in their seats, eyes sweeping from the general to me and back again. I felt them registering what was happening, trying to place me in a new context, trying to understand why a four-star general would be saluting a woman in a simple navy dress standing near the exit. No insignia. No title announced. Just me. And then he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, echoing off the church's vaulted ceiling with the authority of command. "It is an honor to stand in your presence." I heard the words and for a second I didn't breathe. Not because I didn't believe them, but because of how foreign it felt to hear them in that place at that moment after what had just happened in the vestibule. My father's words were still burning in my chest. The way he'd looked at me like I was a stain on the fabric of his perfect day. But now the silence was filled with something else. Not shame. Not accusation. Reverence. I stood completely still, my mind trying to catch up with the shift that had just cracked the entire day open. My father had told me I didn't belong here. The general had just made it clear that I did. And not just as a guest. As someone to be honored. Behind him, Caleb looked torn between awe and discomfort. Maybe he hadn't expected his whisper to carry such weight. Or maybe he hadn't realized what it would mean to name me. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. My eyes were fixed on General Hale, and in his stance I saw no doubt, no performative flattery. He meant every word. A flicker of something tightened in my throat. I hadn't cried in years. Not at memorials, not at funerals, not even when I signed the discharge papers. But in that moment, with dozens of eyes turning toward me and a man who'd once led thousands offering me the kind of respect my own father couldn't muster, I felt the heat press behind my eyes like a threat. I straightened my shoulders. I didn't salute back, there was no need to. This wasn't protocol. This was something else, something deeper. I gave a slow nod instead, steady and quiet, like the kind you give a comrade you recognize across the room. He returned the nod, lowered his hand and sat back down without another word. The room remained hushed, almost reverent, the kind of silence that holds its breath. And I stood there, still by the door, not as a ghost or an unwelcome shadow, but as someone whose presence had just been acknowledged in full daylight. My body moved before my mind caught up, muscle memory overriding everything else, and I returned the salute without thinking, my hand lifting with practiced precision to my brow in acknowledgement. It wasn't flashy or exaggerated, just clean, solid, and instinctive, the kind of motion drilled into me from day one, the kind that came from years of standing in heat and sand and cold and chaos, from saluting those above and beside me and far too many who never came home. For a fraction of a second my fingers lingered in place, rigid with something that felt like muscle but was really memory. Then I lowered my arm and the silence in the church deepened. I felt the moment crash in around me like a slow wave, not loud but heavy, the way silence sometimes is when it's filled with watching eyes and held breaths. Dozens of heads had turned now, faces looking back at me with questions they couldn't ask out loud, with expressions shifting between confusion, awe, and something like quiet discomfort. I could feel them reassessing me, resorting me in their mental seating charts, not just as the estranged older sister in a plain dark dress, but as someone a man like Everett Hale would salute in front of everyone. Whatever quiet judgment they might have formed about my presence had been interrupted, knocked off balance by that gesture. Not erased but paused. And then I saw my father. He hadn't moved. He was still standing near the edge of the vestibule, but his entire body had changed. The rigidity that usually framed him, the square set of his shoulders, the firm grip on control, had cracked. He looked pale, almost gray, his mouth slightly parted like a man who had taken a blow he never saw coming. There was no anger on his face. Just disbelief. And something behind it, a hollow kind of realization that he no longer controlled the narrative in the room. The script he had prepared, the one where I was the embarrassment, the unwanted reminder, the mistake he could manage with a few whispered words, had unraveled in front of everyone, exposed for what it was. The shame he had been so ready to drape over me like a second skin no longer fit. Not after that salute. He looked like he didn't know what to do next. And for the first time in years I didn't care. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but the music resumed, the musicians recovering as if some invisible cue had nudged them forward. The murmurs around the church quieted, and the guests slowly turned back toward the front, though the air still buzzed faintly with the aftermath of the moment. It wasn't the same room it had been 10 minutes ago. Something had shifted beneath the surface, like a tectonic plate clicking into place. I looked at the rows of seats still half empty near the back, and for a breath, I considered turning around again and leaving, escaping while I could before anyone else spoke to me, before my presence became another kind of spectacle. But then I saw Madison's dress, just a glimpse through the slightly open sanctuary doors, the edge of her veil, the soft flutter of lace and movement, and I thought about why I came. I hadn't flown here for anyone else. Not for my father. Not for strangers in folding chairs. Not even for recognition. I came for her. Because she asked me to. And so I walked down the aisle. Not quickly. Not with a flourish. Just steady steps, each one measured, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. I didn't look at the guests as I passed them, though I could feel their eyes. Some followed me all the way to the end of the row, some turned away as if unsure what to make of me, but it didn't matter. Their questions, their surprise, their stories they might later tell, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I chose to stay. I slid into an empty seat in the fourth row on the bride's side, the cool wood pressing against my back like a reminder that I was solid, present, unshaken. No one told me to sit. No usher guided me. No invitation was needed. I simply took the seat because I decided I would. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me permission. The scent of lilies faded into the background as the church filled slowly around me, but I barely noticed. I was staring at the polished altar ahead, yet I wasn't seeing any of it. Instead, I was back in that old house 2 miles from the river, the one with the chipped white siding and the shutters my mother used to repaint every spring even though my father said it was a waste of time. I could almost hear the sound of cicadas rattling through the summer heat, the buzz of the screen door slamming shut behind me, the creak of floorboards that betrayed every step we took. That house never let you move quietly. Even when I was a child, I remember thinking it was a place that kept secrets poorly. It was the kind of home where rules lived on the walls like portraits. Shoes off. Bed made. No elbows on the table. Speak when spoken to. And above all else, do not contradict him. My father didn't raise his voice much. He didn't have to. He believed in discipline as a philosophy, not just a tool, and he wore it like a second skin. Everything had its order, and anything that strayed from that order was treated like a personal betrayal. Madison, with her careful hands and gentle voice, slid into that structure like she was made for it. She kept her room neat, never questioned bedtime, learned how to smile when she didn't mean it. She thrived under his expectations the way flowers grow when the sun lands just right. But I didn't. I was the one who asked why we prayed before dinner even when no one went to church anymore. I was the one who wouldn't wear the dress with the itchy lace collar just because it was Sunday. I was the one who refused to stand still for family photos, who argued about curfews in college and why being a girl meant I had to be quieter, softer, smaller. He hated it. Not just my words, but the way I said them, the challenge in my tone, the way I never looked away when he glared. He called it disrespect. I called it breathing. When I told him I enlisted, he didn't say anything at first. Just stared at me like I had spit on the floor. His jaw clenched, that familiar twitch in his temple pulsing with fury he didn't let out yet. I think he expected it to be a phase. He said I was running away, said I'd come crawling back once the real world taught me a lesson. I told him I wasn't running, I was choosing. Choosing to carve something for myself that didn't belong to him. Choosing to serve a cause that meant something beyond the boundaries of our house, our town, his name. He told me I was disgracing the family. He never forgave me. I stopped trying to make him understand after the first deployment. He didn't write. He didn't ask. When I came home once for Christmas, I found my old room turned into storage, the walls bare, my bed replaced with a treadmill no one used. Madison gave me a blanket and said she was sorry. She always said she was sorry, as if her apologies could paper over the gaps he never tried to fill. But I never blamed her. She did what she had to do to survive in a house that punished deviation. Our mother had been the only soft place in that house. She didn't argue with him in public, but in quiet moments, she'd press a cool hand to my forehead when I was feverish or leave notes in my lunchbox with little drawings. She'd sit beside me on the back porch while he watched the news inside, and she'd whisper things that stayed long after she was gone. I remember once, after he berated me for getting a B in math, she found me in the backyard, kicking at the dirt, face red and hot from holding in tears. She knelt down, brushed the hair from my eyes and said, "Don't let his narrow vision make you small, baby. You hear me? You're bigger than the box he built." She died the year before I shipped out. Cancer. Quick and cruel. He didn't cry at the funeral. Just stood stiff in his suit, hands folded like he was standing at inspection. Madison wept so hard I thought her ribs would break, but he didn't touch her. I kept staring at the empty space on his face where grief should have lived and realized that some men don't feel lost the way others do. Or maybe they do, but they don't let it change them. After she was gone, there was nothing left to bridge the space between us. I sat now in the fourth row of the church, hands folded in my lap, watching petals drift in the air-conditioned breeze like fragments of old pages. I could still hear her voice, still feel the weight of her hand when she squeezed mine in quiet defiance. Her words had followed me to war zones, to hospitals, to nights alone on a cot under a half-broken ceiling fan. They followed me here. I hadn't planned to remember her today, but it was inevitable. Every time I stood at the edge of a place I wasn't supposed to enter, every time someone tried to tell me I was too loud, too hard, too much, I heard her say it again. Bigger than the box he built. That house by the river had been quiet for years, but it never really left me. It clung to the corners of my mind in the way rigid homes do, in the shape of expectations and the echo of slammed doors. But I had stepped out of it a long time ago. I carried the weight of its silence with me, yes, but not the shame. Not anymore. I never talked about what I did over there. Not in detail. Not to family. Not to friends. Not even to Madison, who once sent me a birthday card with a glittery eagle sticker on the envelope and wrote, "You're a badass even if you never tell me why." It wasn't modesty that kept me quiet. It wasn't fear. It was the understanding that most people didn't want the truth. They wanted headlines trimmed into slogans, movies without blood, stories with just enough weight to impress them, not disturb them. What I carried didn't belong in dinner conversations or polite catch-ups over coffee. And I never needed the spotlight. I had done the work because it needed to be done. That was enough. At least I told myself it was. But the silence chipped away over time in places no one could see. I'd spent years doing things most people couldn't imagine. Navigating foreign terrain under moonless skies, radio pressed to my chest as we moved through corridors that reeked of gasoline and something worse. I learned to read silence like a language, to feel the pulse of danger in the way birds stopped chirping or how wind moved differently near explosives. I trained until my body could function in heat that melted plastic, in fatigue that blurred the line between waking and dream. I bandaged wounds that would never fully heal and carried men who whispered their mothers' names while bleeding out in my arms. I buried friends without eulogies, just coordinates logged in encrypted files. And I did it all without fanfare. Without medals on display. Without parades. It wasn't that they didn't give us ribbons. They did. I just never wore them home. To my father, all of it was a footnote. He'd once called my deployments tours, like I was on some kind of extended vacation that had gone on a little too long. He never asked what I did specifically. Never wanted to hear about the missions I led, the teams that trusted me with their lives, the moments where I stood in the center of chaos and made calls that would follow me for the rest of my life. He referred to my service as, "your time in the army," the way someone might mention a gap year or a study abroad program. Polite, distant, vague. It wasn't ignorance. It was dismissal. I stopped correcting him after a while. And still I kept going. I moved through a system that wasn't built to see me, let alone recognize me. I was a woman in combat, a medic who refused to be a statistic, a name on a roster full of ghosts. I worked harder, stayed sharper because I knew there were people like my father. Men who thought of women in uniform as a novelty, something ornamental or temporary. I never wanted to be anyone's symbol. I wanted to be counted. And I was by the people who mattered. Which is why, when General Hale stood and saluted me in front of that church full of strangers, it wasn't confusion that I felt. It was a click, a slow and deliberate acknowledgement of something long overdue. His face wasn't surprised. It was certain. He knew who I was. Not just vaguely. Not by name alone. He knew what I'd done, likely had known for years. He hadn't been reacting to the moment. He had been waiting for the chance to speak the truth out loud in a room full of people who had never cared to ask. It hit me harder than I expected. Because for so long I had moved through this world unseen. Not invisible exactly. Just overlooked. People saw what they wanted to, quiet, serious, maybe a little withdrawn. They didn't see the fire I kept buried under layers of stillness, the scars that didn't leave marks, the decisions that haunted me in the hours before dawn. They didn't see the warrior. But he did. And in that instant, everything I had held back came rushing to the surface. Not just pride but grief too. Grief for the years I spent proving myself in silence, for the conversations I never had with my father, for the ache of recognition withheld too long. The general's salute wasn't just for me. It was for every overlooked hour, every unspoken sacrifice, every time I'd sat at a dinner table and swallowed the truth because it didn't fit the narrative. He gave it weight. He gave it shape. He made it undeniable. It didn't matter that I wasn't in uniform. That I wasn't the bride or the centerpiece or even someone the guests could place. In that moment I was seen, not as someone's daughter, not as someone's sister, but as the soldier I had become and the woman I had always been. And that was more than I had ever asked for. The reception felt like a room holding its breath. The music was soft, some old love song playing beneath the gentle clink of glassware and silver, but the air was too careful, too measured. People spoke in low tones, their eyes drifting in my direction when they thought I wasn't looking, then snapping back to their tablemates with polite smiles and empty toasts. Madison laughed too loudly once near the head table, her hand gripping Caleb's arm like a lifeline. And though her joy looked genuine, I recognized the edge in it, the kind of brightness that covers nerves. No one said anything to me directly. They passed by and nodded or smiled too quickly. A few murmured polite nothings about how lovely the ceremony had been, how beautiful the flowers were, how wonderful it was to see everyone again. But none of them asked me how I'd been, what I'd done, why the general stood for me. They didn't ask because they already knew something had happened, and they didn't want to wade into the depth of it. I sat near the back, close to the open windows that let in the scent of pine and honeysuckle, my drink untouched in front of me, hands clasped in my lap. I was content there, out of reach but still present, close enough to watch Madison dance in her white satin gown but far enough that I didn't become the center of another conversation. I didn't want praise. I didn't need curiosity. I just wanted to observe, to sit in that moment with my own kind of peace. No longer braced against the judgment that had defined so many of our family gatherings. Solitude didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt earned. It was hours before he approached me. My father waited until most of the crowd had thinned. Plates had been cleared, the band had taken a break, and the sky outside the windows had turned a deep purplish blue. He moved slowly, his hands in his pockets, the stiffness in his shoulders more pronounced now without an audience to hold him up. He didn't sit. He stood next to my chair and looked down at me like a man trying to find a version of someone he once knew but couldn't quite recognize. "I didn't know," he said. The words were quiet, reluctant, like they had been forced out of him one syllable at a time. I didn't look up at first. I traced the rim of my glass with one finger and let the silence stretch between us until it nearly folded. When I finally spoke, my voice was even. "You didn't ask." It wasn't meant to wound. It was the truth, plain and flat as a blade laid on a table. He had lived in the same house as me for 18 years and had never once asked me why I joined, what I saw, how I changed. He had asked about grades, about chores, about whether I was planning to wear that to dinner. But not about me. Not really. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way he used to when he was deciding whether to lecture or walk away. I wondered if he even knew what to say to me now, if he had rehearsed something in his head and lost the words the moment he got close. I waited not out of hope but out of habit, the same way I used to wait at the top of the stairs as a teenager, hoping he might come check on me after one of our fights. He never had. She shouldn't have had him do that, he muttered finally, almost to himself. I turned my eyes to him then, calm but sharp. She didn't. He frowned, confused. The general. I know who you meant. He paused. He made it into something it didn't need to be. No, I said, voice quiet but firm. He showed respect. My father's face tightened, the muscles around his mouth twitching like he wanted to say more but wasn't sure he could. He had lived his whole life believing control was power, that silence was strength, and now he stood in front of a daughter who no longer needed his approval, who had walked into a room full of people prepared to be small and had been made visible by someone whose opinion could not be dismissed. He didn't reply. He just stood there for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. Not angry. Not resolved. Just unsure of where he stood now. I watched him go, watched the way the reception light caught the silver in his hair, the way his back curved ever so slightly under the weight of something unspoken. For the first time he looked old. Not worn down by years, but by the distance he had helped build and was only just beginning to see. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel triumph. I felt still. Then I turned back toward the window, toward the fading sky, and let the hush of the evening settle around me like a cloak I had carried across continents. There was nothing left to explain. Dinner had just begun when the soft clinking of a fork against a wine glass called the room to stillness. Conversations died down with the rustle of napkins and the last few shifting chairs, and then all attention turned to the man slowly rising near the head table. General Everett Hale stood with the weight of someone who had carried authority for decades, the kind of presence that didn't need elevation or a microphone to command a room. He held a glass in one hand but he didn't raise it. He didn't smile. His expression was thoughtful, distant, as though the words he was about to speak weren't rehearsed but pulled from somewhere far deeper than ceremony demanded. When he began, his voice was calm and deliberate, the tone of a man who had seen too much to waste a single sentence. Weddings, he said, are often a time to celebrate not only love, but what it takes to protect it. What it takes to make it endure. There was a murmur of agreement, polite nods from guests, but no one quite knew where he was going yet. They listened, waiting for the toast to turn sentimental or funny, something safe and expected. It didn't. He continued, his eyes scanning the room with a steadiness that made you feel as if he were speaking directly to you, even when he wasn't. There are people in this world who carry more than their share. They do it without fanfare. Without speeches. They step forward into places most would never go, and they carry burdens most will never see. These people, quiet, steady, often unnoticed, don't ask to be recognized. But sometimes that's exactly why they must be. No names. No titles. But the current that passed through the room was unmistakable. Fork stilled. Hands hovered midair. Eyes darted subtly toward where I sat, even if they didn't fully turn. I felt my throat tighten, the pressure building in my chest not from embarrassment, but from the sudden awareness that someone had finally said it. What I had lived, what I had endured, what I had been denied for so long. Said it aloud. Said it plainly. And not for sympathy but for truth. The general's gaze passed briefly over me. No pause, no gesture, but it landed and then moved on. He wasn't speaking to elevate me in that moment. He was speaking to place something in the center of the room that could no longer be ignored. Service, he said, isn't always obvious. It doesn't always wear ribbons or arrive with brass bands. Sometimes it moves through the world unseen, saving lives, holding lines, making impossible choices in silence. And when we overlook it, when we reduce it to something vague or forgettable, we lose something essential about who we are supposed to be, about what we owe each other. At that table I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just listened. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in waves too quiet to hear but too powerful to ignore. I knew who those words were for. So did my father. I didn't have to turn to look at him. I felt him, sitting stiff just 2 tables away, surrounded by cousins and neighbors who were probably wondering what he was thinking, what he might say next. But he didn't say anything. He sat in that stillness like a man who had come face to face with something he'd refused to see for too long. The subtext wasn't subtle. The truth wasn't disguised. And there was no version of the story where he could pretend not to understand anymore. General Hale concluded simply. To those who serve, and to those who recognize the cost of it even when the world does not. Then he raised his glass, finally, and others followed, though hesitantly. A few toasts echoed around the room, soft and unsure, and the clinking of glasses resumed. But the energy had changed again, sharpened into something quieter, heavier. I didn't touch my glass. I didn't need to. I sat in the warmth of a truth finally spoken, unadorned, unchallenged. And my father, for once in his life, had no words to contradict it. He came back when most of the guests had left, when the night had softened into that low humming quiet that follows too much celebration. The tables were littered with half-empty glasses and discarded programs, flower petals stuck to the bottoms of heels and the edges of linen. I was outside near the patio, leaning against the railing beneath the string lights, their soft amber glow spilling over the rim of my glass, casting a halo around the silence I had earned. I heard his steps before I saw him, measured, slow, as if the weight of everything that hadn't been said all these years had finally begun pressing into his spine. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't try to smile. He just stood there beside me in the dark and asked, "Who are you to him?" I didn't need to ask who he meant. The question came out low and uneven, like he hated himself for having to ask it but hated me more for knowing the answer. I turned my face toward him slowly, watching the lines in his face twitch beneath the tension he barely contained. I could see it written across his expression. Not curiosity, not even jealousy, but disbelief that something had happened tonight he didn't anticipate, couldn't control, and worst of all, didn't understand. I met his stare without flinching. "A colleague," I said. "A person he trusts." The words landed like an open palm to the chest. I saw it in the way he blinked hard and looked down, his lips pressing into a line as if trying to force a new narrative out of the cracked shell of the old one. He looked in that moment not like a man seeking connection, but like one grasping at the last threads of the world he thought he built. The world where he knew what mattered, where the titles on his wall and the tone of his voice decided everything beneath his roof. But that world didn't fit anymore. He stared at the floorboards beneath our feet, and when he spoke again, his voice was brittle. "I didn't know. I let the silence sit. I didn't fill it for him. I didn't soften. I waited until he finally looked at me again, and then I answered with the same clarity that had carried me through firefights and boardrooms, the tone I used when every word had to matter. You never wanted to hear it." He opened his mouth, a breath caught between apology and defense, but I didn't give him room to spin the old excuses into something new. I had heard them before. How he was trying to protect me, how he thought he was being practical, how the world was harsh and a father's job was to harden his children to survive it. But none of that explained the silence. None of that excused the years of disinterest, the refusal to ask, the condescending way he dismissed my choices while pretending to value strength. "You made me small so you could stay large," I said quietly. "And when I refused to shrink, you looked away." There was a beat where he stood absolutely still, like he didn't know if I was finished or just beginning. His shoulders sagged slightly, not out of remorse, but out of the slow realization that the foundation he'd built, of hierarchy, of obedience, of being the center of gravity, was no longer solid beneath him. He had shaped his identity around knowing more, leading more, being more. And tonight, someone outside his carefully crafted sphere had recognized me, not as his daughter but as a peer. That reality bent something in him. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just stood there, stripped bare of the posture that once defined him. "I didn't think," he tried, voice thinner now. "I didn't realize you." I cut in again, not cruelly but with precision. "You didn't want to know who I became. You wanted me to stay someone you could dismiss." He didn't reply. And there it was, silence again, but this time it didn't protect him. It exposed him. He had spent so long shaping his version of truth around what he could see, what he could command, that when someone else, someone with more rank, more recognition, more respect, had stood up and spoken the truth he had refused to acknowledge, it shattered the illusion he'd clung to for years. And now he was standing in the aftermath, unsure of what was left to salvage. I didn't move. I didn't reach for him. I just let the night settle back into its quiet, the music faint through the walls behind us, the wind brushing softly through the trees. Whatever this was, this unraveling, it was his to carry now. I had already carried enough. The last of the guests were slipping out into the warm night, their laughter faint and trailing behind them like the hem of a long dress dragging through dew. The music had faded into soft background murmurs, and someone had begun breaking down the tables along the far edge of the reception hall. Madison was tucked somewhere in the center of a hug, her veil long forgotten, her hair slightly undone in that beautiful, exhausted way that comes after hours of celebration. I watched her from across the room, my arms crossed loosely over my chest, grounded in the silence I had come to prefer, the kind that lets truth rise in your chest without the static of others filling the air. He came to me slowly this time, not with hesitation, but with an air of something quieter, something less defined by anger or pride. He didn't announce himself. He simply stepped up beside me, close enough that I could hear his breathing shift, and for a moment we stood there, not looking at each other, just facing the quiet end of a long day that had dragged years of silence into the light. Then he spoke, not quite meeting my eyes. "I thought you chose something smaller." The words landed with the kind of weight only a man like him could place behind something so deceptively simple. Smaller. The word twisted through my ribs, shaped by all the years he had mistaken silence for insignificance, restraint for weakness, service for submission. He hadn't seen what I built because he hadn't bothered to look. And now, finally, he was trying to find a thread to hold on to, even if it was the wrong one. I turned toward him slowly and stared straight through whatever part of him had once expected me to be impressed by his disappointment. "I chose something real," I said, the words calm but unshakable, each one placed like stone. "You just didn't recognize it." His face barely moved. A slight shift in his brow, a muscle in his jaw tightening, but he didn't argue. For once he didn't cut me off. He didn't try to reframe my choices in his language or shrink them into versions that made sense within his narrow vocabulary. He didn't nod. He didn't flinch. He just listened. I couldn't remember the last time he had done that. Really listened without scanning my words for flaws or ammunition. And the stillness between us wasn't filled with resentment or performance. It was just quiet, like he knew whatever came next couldn't be rehearsed. I held his gaze, not to challenge but to hold ground I had earned. "You speak about my life like you built it," I said, the words low and precise. "You make assumptions. You reduce it to things you understand because anything more makes you uncomfortable." He started to speak then, his lips parting with the reflex of old habits, but I lifted my hand slightly, not to silence him with force, but to finish my thought before it was lost beneath the noise of old patterns. "Don't speak for me in rooms I'm standing in." The sentence didn't rise in volume, didn't strike like a weapon. It settled. It sank into the space between us with a finality he couldn't deflect. I watched it hit him, not hard, not cruelly, but clearly, like a line drawn across years of unspoken rules and inherited silence. He lowered his eyes just briefly and I saw something slip through, the faintest hint of a man who finally understood he wasn't the center of every story told under his roof. We didn't say goodbye. We didn't touch. He stood beside me for a few moments longer, breathing like he had more to say and knew that none of it would hold. Then, with a small shift of his shoulders, he turned and walked back into the flickering shadows of a hall being dismantled around him. And I remained by the window, upright, unshaken, a quiet answer to the version of me he had imagined all these years. The reception hall had mostly emptied by the time he approached me again. The chairs were being folded, candles snuffed out one by one, and the last few strands of music from the speakers dissolved into quiet static. I stood alone near the back corner, watching the staff collect wine glasses with practiced efficiency. I hadn't expected him to return. I figured the general had said what he needed to say during his toast, measured, powerful, dignified as expected. But then I heard his footsteps behind me, calm and certain, the sound of someone who was never uncertain about his place in a room. I turned and met his eyes before he spoke. He didn't bother with small talk. No pleasantries. No preamble. Just the truth. "You saved my son," he said. For a moment I didn't understand. I must have looked confused because he continued before I could ask. "He was pinned down in a village outside Cost. You weren't on the manifest. Your team wasn't assigned to that quadrant. But someone intercepted intel that an ambush was building, and a unit moved in preemptively. No casualties. Extraction within 40 minutes. He was on that transport. You led the operation." I felt something freeze inside me. I didn't remember names from that mission. Only grid coordinates, call signs, the adrenaline of moving through narrow corridors with compromised visibility and too many unknowns. It had been one of those assignments where we were told the minimal amount required, where confirmation came later, if at all. We moved in shadows, often under no flag. No identifiers. Clean hands, deniable footprints. I hadn't known anyone on that team personally. We were given orders, we followed them, and then we disappeared again. He took a slow breath. We didn't know who had pulled it off until weeks later. But I remember reading the after-action report. Minimal signature. Maximum efficiency. No civilian harm. I asked someone in command and they told me the name of the operator who planned the route and improvised the entry point. They called her the Ghost. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was reaching back through smoke and heat and coded maps, through the scent of sand burned to glass and the rush of blood in my ears while trying to read a situation 10 steps ahead. I remembered the shape of that night, the cold edge of my rifle's grip, the tension in the team's shoulders as we slipped behind walls that had once been homes. I remembered the silence of a mission executed perfectly, the kind that ends not with celebration but with exhale. You didn't know it was him, the general said, and it wasn't a question. I shook my head once. That's the thing about people like you, he added. You don't do it for credit. You don't look back to see who's watching. You just do the work. His voice didn't waver, but I could hear something beneath it now. Something personal, something vulnerable. It was the voice of a father who had almost lost a son, who had lived in the terror of that almost, and now stood in front of the person who had changed that trajectory without ever knowing. I watched you today, he said. I saw how you stayed on the edges, how you let others speak first. I've seen that before in people who've seen too much, done too much, and carry more than they'll ever be able to explain. My throat was tight now. I hadn't expected gratitude. I certainly hadn't expected this. I had lived so long in the quiet, beneath the surface of recognition, that being seen so precisely, so accurately, was almost harder to absorb than being ignored. I meant what I said, he added. It was an honor. I nodded once, slow and quiet, not because I didn't believe him but because the weight of what he had given me, clarity, respect, a piece of truth I'd never known I needed, settled deep in my chest like a puzzle piece finally dropped into place. He didn't owe me that story. Most never would have told it. But he had, and now it belonged to me. He looked me in the eye one last time. You'll always have my respect. Not just for what you did, but for how you've carried it. Then he turned, gave me space, and left me there with the truth I hadn't expected but finally understood. I had never needed glory. I had only ever wanted to do what was right. And even in silence, even in shadow, it had mattered. It had always mattered. It was late, the kind of late that softens even the sharpest voices, when people speak in half volumes and laughter becomes rare, reverent, tucked into corners rather than paraded through the air. A few candles still flickered on the side tables, their wax pooling beneath them in lazy spirals, while plates had been cleared and the last of the champagne poured. The reception was winding down like a record spinning its final rotations. And then, without ceremony, the general stood again. He didn't rise for a toast. He didn't tap a glass or lift a hand for silence. He simply stood and the air shifted. Some people noticed, straightened slightly in their chairs. Others kept speaking, unaware that they were about to be silenced not by volume but by weight. His voice was low, almost conversational. There are things, he said, that are done quietly, out of necessity, not shame. A few heads turned. His hands were at his sides, not folded or clenched, just resting. He wasn't reading from notes. He wasn't building to a point. He was simply placing words into the room like stones, smooth and undeniable. There are people who do hard things so others don't have to. Not because they're ordered to. Not because they seek reward. But because it's right. And because they can. The stillness spread then, uncoordinated but absolute. Even the servers paused where they stood, one holding a tray midair. I watched from a few paces back, standing near the far column, not entirely visible but not hiding either. My arms were crossed gently, not defensively. The weight in the general's voice wasn't about performance. It was about the effort of telling the truth when the world expects pretense. They don't usually make speeches, he said. They don't often sit in the center of a room. They don't talk about what they've done. They carry it. A breath moved through the crowd, not one sound but many. A soft sigh, a shifting of fabric, a fork placed quietly on porcelain. Eyes moved around the space, uncertain who he was talking about. But I didn't need the clarity. I already knew. They are rarely the ones we clap for, he continued. But they are the ones we rely on when clapping no longer matters. And then he stopped. No flourish. No toast. No pointed stare. He simply returned to his seat, his words trailing behind him like smoke from a long extinguished fire. I turned slightly then, not toward him but toward the figure sitting alone near the third row of tables. My father. He hadn't moved the entire time. His back was straighter than it had been earlier in the evening, but the tension in his body had shifted. Not braced. Not poised. Just still. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. For the first time he seemed to hear everything without trying to arrange it into an argument. There was no interruption waiting behind his lips, no urge to correct or diminish. I watched the slow, incremental way his face changed. Not dramatically, not like someone having a revelation, but like a man slowly realizing that something he had held as absolute might have been incomplete all along. He looked smaller not because he had shrunk but because the frame he had always placed around himself, the certainties, the authority, the belief that his way was the only way, had finally been cracked. He had spent years building an image of me that fit his narrow expectations. Difficult, defiant, distant. But now he was watching that image collapse under the weight of a truth he hadn't shaped. A truth delivered without accusation, without names, without spectacle. And in its place, for the first time, I saw him look not through me, not past me, but at me. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. But in that stillness was something closer to recognition than I had ever seen in his eyes. Not regret. Not apology. Just the raw, uncertain gaze of someone finally beginning to see what had always been there. Me. Not as a burden. Not as a mistake. Not even as a daughter he had failed to control. But as someone worth knowing. The wedding wound down the way all long days do, slowly and without ceremony. The sun had disappeared behind the trees, leaving only streaks of lavender sky through the high windows of the reception hall. People hugged each other goodbye, carried their heels in their hands, loosened ties, and wandered toward cars with sleepy grins and crumpled programs clutched like afterthoughts. I stood near the edge of the room, the scent of spilled wine and wilting flowers hanging in the warm air, when I saw Madison walking toward me barefoot, her veil gone, her hair pulled into a loose knot that didn't match the magazine-perfect version she started the day with, but suited her more. She didn't say anything at first. She just extended her hand. I took it. There was no speech, no apology tucked into the gesture. She pulled me gently toward the center of the floor, where the music had faded into something softer, almost invisible beneath the murmurs of departing guests. We danced in a slow, clumsy circle, her hand in mine, her other hand resting lightly against my shoulder, our eyes never quite locking for too long, but our steps moving in time. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't meant to be. But it felt like something real. Something that had survived the space between us, the years of being shaped differently by the same walls. Whatever we hadn't said no longer needed to be said. We were still here. That was enough. My father approached me later. Not immediately, not while others were watching, but after the room had emptied of most witnesses, when the only people left were family and staff folding linens into tight white squares. He stood a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his posture subdued in a way I hadn't seen before. Not defeated. Just less performative. He asked if I would meet him for coffee before I left town. His voice was quiet, almost unsure, and he didn't layer the request with an explanation. He didn't act like he deserved the time. He simply asked. I said yes. But I set terms. We sit. We talk. You listen, I told him plainly. And you don't speak for me. Not anymore. He nodded. A slow, deliberate nod. Not the automatic kind, but one that came with effort, like he was swallowing every habit he used to lean on. We met the next morning at a diner just outside town. The kind with old booths and chipped coffee mugs and a waitress who called everyone hon, even when her hands were full. I wore jeans and a soft black shirt. He came in a clean button-down, his hair still damp from the shower, like he was trying in some small way to arrive without armor. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about the general or the salute or the speeches that rewrote the atmosphere of the day. We talked about the coffee, the weather, the eggs that were a little too rubbery. The small things that let people find the rhythm of a conversation again after years of silence. And then halfway through his second cup he said it. He didn't look up from his mug when he did. His voice was even, stripped of performance. "I won't speak for you anymore." I let the moment stretch, not to test him but to hear the fullness of it. There was no but waiting at the end, no attempt to explain the past or tie it in a neat bow. Just a sentence, clean and direct. I looked at him for a long second, then nodded once. "That's enough." And I meant it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't repair. It didn't erase the years he spent refusing to see me. But it was clarity. It was air returning to a room I'd been locked out of for too long. Not a doorway thrown open, but a window cracked just enough to let breath move freely between two people who had never truly spoken without armor. We finished our meal quietly. He paid. I left a tip. We walked out into the parking lot beneath the pale morning sun, not changed but no longer pretending. And that was all it needed to be.